Yes, I'm here. Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. I call this October 2020 meeting of the Ncua Board to order. Yesterday, the Ncua Board voted to remove the Request for Information, Supervisory Guidance Review and Improvements in Communications from today's agenda, and no earlier announcement of the change was feasible. I want to note for the record that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, today's meeting is open to the public via a live webcast only. I'd also like to note that all participants in today's webcast meeting are participating remotely. I'd like to take this time to thank Rob Foster and his colleagues from the Office of the Chief Information Officer for their assistance in making today's meeting possible. And I'd also like to thank Jerry Poliquin, our Board Secretary, for his hard work and also assisting with today's meeting. We are now in our 7th month of a remote work posture. Over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ncua has taken prudent and meaningful measures to provide guidance and regulatory relief to the credit union industry and the more than 122 million member owners they serve. The safety of our employees, credit union members, and credit union staff all remain our top priority. Where possible, we have been proactive in our approach to the COVID-19 relief, from our resource and contingency planning to the CARES Act provisions, including changes to the Central Liquidity Facility. However, I think it's important to note that we're in the eye of the hurricane right now. It is virtually impossible for us to predict the full economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We don't know what the credit loss impact will be, but we are indeed being vigilant. We've taken many sound steps to plan for the economic fallout and have dedicated significant staff time and resources to this effort. I am pleased to say that nearly every rule the Ncua Board has considered in recent months has been related to COVID-19 relief. Additionally, we have issued 26 pieces of guidance and advanced several rulemakings, all with the intent to give credit unions the flexibility they need serving their member owners during this trying time. We are indeed committed to keeping our communication channels open. I am pleased to share that since the start of COVID-19, traffic to the Ncua's public website increased significantly, with double-digit increases in the number of visitors to both ncua.gov and mycreditunion.gov. That pattern has continued well into autumn. We remain up nearly 17% in users and more than 13% in sessions compared to this very same time last year on ncua.gov and mycreditunion.gov, which I said is also both well up to over 13% in both categories, respectively. Since the onset of our remote work posture, I've made it clear to the industry that Ncua is open for business. Throughout the duration of the pandemic, we have listened to feedback and suggestions from the industry. In fact, I'm in constant communication with credit union leaders, many of whom tell me how the guidance and rulemakings are giving them the flexibility they need to help their members navigate this challenging environment. In addition to our regular communication with credit union leaders, we have made it a priority to let Congress know the tools we need in the toolbox during the pandemic. Earlier this year, I sent a letter to the Senate Banking Chairman Crapo, identifying statutory changes that would benefit credit unions and their member owners amid the pandemic. Following that letter, an industry stakeholder wrote, and I quote, "The recommendations in your letter to Chairman Crapo are vitally important to credit unions, ensuring continued viability of the Central Liquidity Facility, flexibility in the prompt corrective action framework, raising the member business lending cap, permanently expanding credit union reach for underserved areas, and the various other recommendations that you provided are all crucial to the success of credit unions, especially in the current times." End quote. I am indeed proud of what this agency and our employees have accomplished, and we will remain ever vigilant as the fallout from the pandemic becomes more acute in the months ahead. Again, my fundamental message is clear, and it's this: the Ncua is open for business, and we will stay open for business for the duration of the pandemic emergency. While our COVID-19 response efforts are a top priority, and we have dedicated extensive time and resources to those efforts, we remain open and focused on our mission-critical work of protecting the safety and soundness of the credit union industry and the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund. I now would like to call our attention to our first agenda item today, which is a board briefing, Cybersecurity Considerations for Boards of Directors During COVID-19. Staff presenting is Johnny E. Davis, Jr., Special Advisor to the Chairman for Cybersecurity and Director, Division of Critical Infrastructure from the Office of Examination and Insurance. Good morning, Johnny.
Good morning, Chairman Hood, Board Member Harper, and Board Member Waters. Thank you for having me today during this 2020 National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. This morning, I would like to cover some considerations for Board of Directors and management to ask their IT and cybersecurity organizations as we continue to maneuver through this uncharted territory of operations during this lengthy pandemic. Slide 2, please. I'd like to set the stage first with a list of COVID-19 related cyber attack vectors. While this list is not meant to be a complete depiction of all today's cyber threats, it does represent cyber attack methods on the rise during COVID-19 with state, organized crime, and insider attackers. Of note, the increase is often simply by way of themes, leveraging all of the activities around COVID-19 as opposed to volume of attack. For example, we could have a similar scenario for tax time or Christmas themes, things of that nature. So folks are leveraging what's in the news today. By way of actual attack, phishing, which we know is a social engineering methodology that leverages fake emails to obtain sensitive information, continues to be on the rise. One of the quick tips we recommend for this is user training and awareness along with technical controls, as well as escalated enforcement practices to ensure lessons are actually learned. Credential stuffing capitalizes on our human habit of reusing account names and passwords. And attackers will simply take that information that they acquire from other sources, run it via what we call a brute force attack, which pretty much runs through all the alphabets and numbers in order to obtain the password, and then try to utilize those on other social media or online activities. One of the quick tips we recommend for this strongly is leveraging multi-factor authentication, where it's something you have, something you know, something you are, to ensure that simple guessing, automated or otherwise, cannot occur. Ransomware, we know, is on the rise. This is where an attacker will encrypt your data, hold it hostage until you pay some sort of ransom. Now, we recommend dynamic logical network design and mature backup and recovery considerations. Investigate whether or not you need cybersecurity insurance. And remember as you go through this that law enforcement continues to state that organizations should not pay the ransom because the trend has pretty much shown that it's no guarantee that you are not going to still have your data published by the attacker. Now, very unique to our remote posture, there's an item called Remote Desktop Protocol, and it's often leveraged in a regular scenario, but uniquely useful during sudden significant increases in remote use of home computing and office connectivity. And here, our quick tip is to make sure that secure configurations and connectivity are in fact in place and monitored accordingly. And the last one that we'd like to highlight are unintentional distributed denial of services. Now, we're very familiar with denial of service in the sense that it saturates network resources so that services, online services, cannot be delivered. But the unintentional component is with so many new remote users using streaming video, music, and other streaming services, they can saturate a network unintentionally. And therefore, we recommend, by way of quick tip, that quality of service and priority of service, essentially managing your bandwidth to what resources and monitoring those accordingly, are in fact in place. To sum it up, the root causes for all of these attacks fall in two primary categories, and that's social engineering, human behavior, or cyber hygiene exploitation, good configuration management. Slide 3, please. So the next 3 slides are going to talk about a primary focus point followed by other considerations to consider. For this one, we focus on business continuity management. And this is where identification and clear understanding of your critical services, system, data, and associated key assets, as well as essential supporting services, are known, how they interact with one another, how they have adjusted to the current conditions we find ourselves operating in. Subordinate to this component, we also recommend a review of priority adjustments for short, mid, and long-term plans. Ensure that you really have the resources available to accomplish those strategic and tactical objectives. And again, we reemphasize making sure your backup and recovery strategies are in place in order to combat some of the attacks mentioned on the previous slide. I'd like to point out that it's more than just having those backups in place and testing those backups, but making sure that malware has not gotten on your backups, so keeping offline backups in place, as well as making sure multi-factor authentication is utilized to access the backups, which should only be done by approved personnel in your administration staff. Slide 4, please. The next consideration is cyber hygiene, and really focusing on the fact that now that we have such a remote access contingent in our organizations, have we taken a look at cyber hygiene to ensure that what was once a handful of remote users is now the majority of our operations, and are they in fact configured in order to conduct business securely? One of the subcomponents we often recommend is a review of port protocol and service management, Ppsm, that ensures that even though a lot of products will like to have open configuration when you first purchase them, really making sure you close any ports, protocols, and services that are not required to conduct your actual business. Because we were hit with the remote posture so quickly, a lot of emergency changes may have taken place in order to maintain business. So from a change management and acquisition vetting perspective, we want to make sure that all normal, standard, and emergency acquisitions, changes, and configurations were in fact vetted appropriately and secure. And most importantly, and you continue to hear this in the slides, is make sure users, particularly new users to remote working, have the training and awareness to understand what they should look for in the environment of their home versus their business place. Slide 5, please. The next ongoing activity that's very important is to make sure that your incident and breach management practices have been up to date for the current remote posture, as well as contingency operations that have lasted longer than most of our contingency plans expect. Make sure that your law enforcement, your legal, your insurance, regulatory, and other stakeholders that you would need in the event of an incident and breach are at the ready in case that occurs. We also recommend increased monitoring, both internal and external. And external, we're referring to your third-party service providers and partners. And also, since we're spending so much more time on collaboration software, the Zooms, the Microsoft Teams, the WebEx, et cetera, really making sure that those are configured securely, as previously mentioned in the hygiene section, but more importantly, that human behavior has been trained to ensure the fact that there's a certain mannerism by which we should conduct conference calls and web conference calls to ensure that we are not inadvertently recorded by another organization that may use that information in an unethical manner. Slide 6, please. So after those 3 slides of current state, we also like to take the opportunity to make sure we leverage this condition for looking forward. Really making sure you've taken a look at your digital strategy and what it would look like if this remote posture ends up being the new norm. The long-term, mid-term, and short-term approaches to how your digital strategy increases, particularly around data management. You now have scenarios where your data will actually be in the folks' homes. They may print that data if you allow that, if you allow that. And they may also attempt to download that data on their personal devices if allowed to be used for remote access. So you really want to make sure you have policies and procedures in place around that, ways to monitor that, as well as ways to enforce any violations around that. The last item on this slide talks about consumer experience and security as mobile banking service delivery increases as well. And one of the things we look around here is making sure that you reassess your relationship with service delivery, service management, even in the area of fintech innovation and partnership. We're just really making sure that you're looking at what the future could hold based on the trends today and use this opportunity to plan accordingly. Slide 7, please. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation. I can answer any questions you may have at this time. Thank you.
Great, Johnny. Thank you for your presentation. National Cybersecurity Awareness Month is underway as we all continue to maneuver our way through working remotely during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Ncua and credit unions must ensure financial services remain resilient during these challenging times. Given those circumstances, today's briefing on questions board members may consider asking their IT cybersecurity staff during the pandemic is indeed timely. When I became chairman a little over a year ago, I made cybersecurity a top priority. In fact, I was very pleased to work with Ncua staff at that time, to create the new position that Johnny now has in addition to his responsibilities in the Office of Examination and Assurance. So we were able to name Johnny as the Special Advisor to the Chairman for Cybersecurity. At that time, I don't think any of us could have fathomed the unprecedented circumstances we are experiencing as a result of the pandemic, with new account fraud, identity theft, cybersecurity risk, and mobile banking application fraud all on the rise as a result of the opportunities related to the ongoing pandemic. Now it is as important as ever that we remain vigilant and mindful of potential cybersecurity threats. I remain committed to helping ensure the data protection of the more than 122 million credit union member owners. The Ncua will make sure the agency and credit unions have the cybersecurity resources they need to mitigate ongoing and emerging cybersecurity risk as appropriate. As evident from our cybersecurity tabletop exercise and associated cybersecurity forum on cybersecurity, hygiene, and ransomware, cybersecurity stakeholders need to continue to proactively work together as appropriate to address the emerging threats and risks the industry faces. Last month, the Ncua Office of the Inspector General issued a report on following its audit of the Ncua's Examination and Oversight Authority over credit union service organizations and vendors. The report found, and I quote, "The Ncua needs authority over QSOs and vendors to effectively identify and reduce the risk vendor relationships pose to credit unions." There is currently nothing in the Federal Credit Union Act that provides the Ncua with the authority to supervise QSOs and vendors, to hold them accountable for unsafe and unsound practices that have direct and lasting impact on the credit unions they serve, end quote. Let me now be very clear. I deeply believe that Congress should consider providing the NCUA with vendor authority to allow the agency to better supervise third-party cybersecurity risk. But, in my view, this should be done post-pandemic recovery. I've made this request to members of the Senate Banking Committee through my recent letter to Senator Crapo, but now I do believe that providing vendor authority now amid the pandemic would place additional burden both on our credit union staff at NCUA as well as the industry at large. But again, I certainly would like to see us have this post-recovery. Now, Johnny, I do have a few questions, sir, for you. One, what are some of the activities occurring during the National Cybersecurity Awareness Month that will heighten visibility into the Information Systems and Assurance Examination Program? I know you have a number of activities planned.
Yes, sir. This is Johnny Davis. As you mentioned, we started off the month with our 2020 tabletop exercise, which was a recap of this past summer's cybersecurity tabletop exercise. We also leveraged that event to have DHS, Secret Service, and FBI present an array of resources that credit unions could leverage while managing their information security programs. We've already had one speaking engagement with Ncua. We will continue to have another 4 with various trade organizations over the course of the month, highlighting some of the activities that are taking place in our Information Systems and Assurance Examination Program. We're also participating with FFIEC on a webinar for business continuity management practices, which is based off of the recent Business Continuity Management IT Handbook, and of course partnering with our Office of the Chief Information Officer on internal activities throughout the month. That concludes my response, sir.
Great, thank you, Johnny. And I do have one other question for you. How are we ensuring our examination staff is prepared for the enhancements within the program?
Yes, sir, this is Johnny. This month, we continue the logistics for ensuring all agency examiners, specialists, IT subject matter examiners, as well as generalists and their management are trained over the next 12 to 24 months on effective identification and implementation of critical security controls. As we begin to leverage the Information Technology Risk Examination Solution for Credit Unions, NTREX, CU, we're moving away from a simple yes-no analytic approach to more of a risk rubric cascading risk consideration that will require an understanding of those critical security controls' effectiveness. That concludes my answer, sir.
Great. I have no further questions, Johnny, but I would just like to acknowledge for the record and for our board meeting today, we have a wonderful resource in Johnny Davis at the NCUA. Johnny often accompanies me to meetings with Treasury, FBI. We've done also meetings with some of the largest consulting firms in the United States, and they all recognize Johnny as a leader. He has the professionalism, the core competencies that really make us proud to have him both at the agency and also for the great work he's doing in the credit union system overall. So I just want you all to know we have someone that really is one of the best leaders of this subject in the country. And Johnny, we are indeed blessed and fortunate to have you at NCUA. I have no further questions, but I would like to turn the floor over to one of my fellow board members. Good morning, Board Member Harper. The floor is yours.
Good morning, Chairman Hood, and happy International Credit Union Day. I also want to echo your comments about Johnny. We are very lucky to have him on our team. Chairman Hood, thank you for agreeing to hold this informative briefing, which I requested earlier this year. And Johnny, as we celebrate Cybersecurity Awareness Month, your presentation on cybersecurity policy issues and the COVID-19 pandemic is well-timed. Like each of my fellow board members, I am deeply concerned about the risk of cyber attacks on our financial system, that it is increasing, not decreasing. Because cybersecurity is one of my priorities, I am pleased that the NCUA in recent years has made progress in maturing our cybersecurity examination program through advances in consistency, transparency, and accountability. We've also made progress in stimulating due diligence of third parties within the credit union system, and we are supporting credit unions with training for staff, informational resources, and grants aimed at improving operational preparedness and resilience. And finally, we've been ensuring the security of the NCUA's systems and collected information. As noted on slide 2 of Johnny's presentation, the current pandemic has increased cybersecurity vulnerabilities for federally insured credit unions, which hold target-rich financial and personal information. Phishing, credential stuffing, ransomware, remote desktop protocol targeting, and distributed denial of service attacks are some of the ways that cyber fraudsters are currently exploiting the vulnerabilities within the credit union system. Johnny, in light of the pandemic and the increased reliance of credit unions on operating remotely, how has the NCUA adjusted the scope of its cybersecurity supervisory priorities?
Yes, sir. This is Johnny Davis. Our immediate concerns have been around remote examinations. So early on, we started to provide some relief and ensure that our examiners were doing remote examinations, if examinations at all, focusing on operational needs as a priority. And one of those items that we did to provide some relief is we realized we had enough information with our previous maturity assessments, facilitated self-assessments in the ACIT product. And we had actually achieved a baseline and understood our baseline moving forward, our benchmark moving forward, rather. So continued focus on resilience and cyber hygiene at a high level with, of course, an emphasis on business continuity management were identified in our priorities for the 5000.20 instruction issued this past summer, and we continue to focus on those priorities. That concludes my response, sir.
Thank you for that information, Johnny. I'd like to explore this issue a little more. During prior briefings, you have highlighted the cybersecurity issues regularly identified during NCUA exams. It would be helpful for you to remind our stakeholders about those issues today. Johnny, would you summarize for us the top 5 cybersecurity problems that NCUA examiners typically find during supervisory contacts? And what is your advice for credit union leaders who want to get out in front of these issues and mitigate potential problems, especially those credit unions with less than $100 million in assets?
Yes, sir. This is Johnny Davis, and I'll answer the question in general terms for this particular forum. I believe the symptoms associated with our previously mentioned priorities are the typical challenges: risk assessment, cyber hygiene, third-party due diligence, etc. I would advise credit union leaders to understand that their assets are substantial to some bad actor, and that there's no such thing in the financial services organizations of being too small to be a target. Institutions that are $100 million in assets present a very lucrative target to some folks. To include the fact that their field of memberships are also attractive opportunities based on potential impact to an industry. If an actor wanted to target a specific industry and cause them financial challenges or stability challenges. And reputation and trust risks can often be more impactful than financial gains in some of these attacks to a credit union or other institution. So I'd say in summary, knowing your inherent risks as a financial services organization, your current risk that's unique to your environment, and your residual risk after you put in the controls that you need to put in place to have a secure environment, that understanding of critical services and associated key assets is a must, immediately followed by disciplined prioritization of the control and practice implementation around them. That concludes my response, sir.
Johnny, I really like your observation about there's not a too small not to be noticed, that everybody's noticed in the credit union space and the financial services world. Johnny, one last question on examinations. With 2020 quickly and thankfully nearing its end, what are the NCUA's tentative cybersecurity examination plans and supervisory focus for 2021?
Yes, sir. This is Johnny Davis. I think the most significant examination plans for 2021 are our execution of the Information Technology Risk Examination for Credit Union, NTREC CU, that we created to harmonize with the other federal regulators and have a more consistent examination approach, not only across NCUA, but across our state counterparts as well. This capability will be deployed within the Merit solution and is already being piloted as such. And I think we're also going to add an emphasis on documenting situations where critical security controls are not appropriately implemented and making sure that we're making progress for getting those done, as those are the foundation for a secure environment. Again, making more quantitative risk analysis capabilities versus historical qualitative analysis. That concludes my response, sir.
Johnny, if a credit union wanted to find more information about NTREC, where would they go to on our website?
If the credit union wanted to find information about NTREC specifically, at this stage, they would look at the link that we provide for FDIC's NTREC information. Once our cybersecurity resource website finishes its development, they can look at the cybersecurity resource website for that information. And in the interim, NTREC and beyond, financial services sector should really focus on DHS's Critical Infrastructure Security Agency, Secret Service, and FBI alert warnings and notifications. We also continue to promote membership and leveraging the early warning information provided by information sharing organizations such as FSISAC and NCU ISAL, Information Sharing and Analysis Organization. Specific to business continuity management, again, we highlight the FFIEC handbook, and of course, a resource that surprisingly is underutilized, NIST itself. This is a free resource for credit unions where they can go get a variety of information on information security at large. That concludes my response, sir.
Thank you, Johnny. And if we could go to slide 3. Here, Johnny, you note that federally insured credit unions need to have sufficient personnel to achieve their cybersecurity priorities, yet we know that it's very difficult to hire and retain cybersecurity experts. Johnny, what 3 tips would you give to credit unions interested in improving their ability to hire and retain cybersecurity experts?
Yes, sir. This is Johnny Davis. I would suggest 3 areas that I've mentioned before and a new area that the right organization should begin to try. Breaking down the stovepipes between our IT staff and our security staff is absolutely the first step. Those silos cause items to be deferred to a specialized security team that really should be taken care of in the IT department when they first acquire and implement the solution. So that remains an important factor. I think credit unions need to also leverage credit union service organizations and other third-party service providers where they can get a better array of capability without the additional financial burden or human capital burden. And I think we should also leverage community colleges, trade schools, and four-year colleges to get interns into our programs and grow that capability at a time when those folks are very eager to participate and, given the right assignment, are more than qualified to do so. Looking forward, I think the trend is going to have to be towards automation. We're not necessarily going to be able to create massive experience out of personnel, even with those 3 items I just mentioned. But having the ability to automate some more routine tasks, routine analysis and reporting, I think is the future for our industry. That too comes with risks, because if you've automated too much and that gets hacked, then the attackers will essentially have a much more easier time at acquiring information, but that should simply be protected as well. That concludes my response, sir.
Johnny, that's really good advice. One last question. I didn't see it on your slideshow. What's the best way for a credit union to contact your office?
The best way for a credit union to contact my office, sir, would be through CU, credit union, CU_cybersecurity@ncua.gov. And we really welcome receiving those questions directly from credit unions without doing anything to compromise the relationship with the regions, but from a national perspective. And we would field those questions with our regional counterparts as well. That concludes my response, sir.
Many thanks, Johnny. The lessons that I take away from today are that credit unions, their vendors, and service providers, and the NCUA need to work together proactively to protect against cybersecurity threats. As noted during today's briefing and during past briefings, the threat of cybersecurity attacks is rising, and financial institutions like credit unions are increasingly vulnerable. That is why I am a very strong supporter of the NCUA having the authority to examine credit unions' third-party vendors and credit union service organizations, and I very much appreciated the statement of the chairman earlier today. In contrast to other financial institutions regulators, the NCUA currently may only examine Qsos and third-party vendors with their permission. Without vendor authority, the NCUA cannot accurately assess either the actual risk present in the credit union system or whether the risk mitigation strategies of Qsos or third-party vendors are adequate and can effectively protect the system. The Government Accountability Office and the Financial Stability Oversight Council have both repeatedly called on Congress to close this regulatory blind spot. And in early September, NCUA's Inspector General issued a report on the oversight of Qsos and vendors. The OIG report determined that the NCUA needs statutory authority over Qsos and vendors to effectively identify and reduce risks vendor relationships pose to credit unions and protect the share insurance fund against losses. I very much agree with the GAO, FSOC, and the NCUA Inspector General. Vendor authority would equip the agency with the tools it needs to better protect the credit union system from cyber threats and safeguard the share insurance fund. Regardless of when Congress acts on vendor authority, financial institutions of all sizes must take a strategic risk management approach, which includes continual hardening and improving the security of their networks, as well as a thorough review and mitigation of risk with their respective supply chains. The NCUA also must continually strengthen the footing of credit unions to respond to cyber threats through our supervision, training, outreach, and grants. As such, I will continue to make cybersecurity and vendor authority two priorities for my work on the NCUA board. Thank you again, Johnny, for your cybersecurity briefing. I very much appreciated it. And Mr. Chairman, I have no further comments at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Harper, and I share your concern about vendor authority and cybersecurity, and I look forward to working with you in the days and months ahead in partnerships so we can both make sizable inroads towards accomplishing our goals. So thank you. I now would like to turn to that. Oh, thank you, sir.
I'm looking. Yeah.
Thank you. And I now would like to recognize Board Member Matt Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Johnny, for your diligence as outlined by the chair. As I have stated over the years, the NCUA needs vendor authority, and it needs that authority immediately, Without vendor authority over cybersecurity, among other areas, we expose the share insurance fund and the credit union community itself to a clear and present danger that may ultimately fall upon the American taxpayers. Simply put, credit unions are spending money, their limited resources on cybersecurity, have an enhanced challenge if the NCUA is not able to examine vendors that the credit union community currently uses. It's a negligent oversight, and I hope that we get the authority sooner rather than later. I would like to also note, as my colleague Mr. Harper did, that it is International Credit Union Day, and I wish all credit unions and all not-for-profit cooperative financial institutions the very best today. As a safety and soundness and consumer protection regulator, I fully appreciate that a credit union system that's growing, thriving, and prospering presents far less of a risk to the share insurance fund. As such, I will endeavor to tailor and target our regulations so as to reach a thoughtful balance between over and under regulation, all within the letter and spirit of the Federal Credit Union Act. This would be greatly assisted with vendor authority so we can take a close, detailed look with Johnny and his team at vendors and reduce that risk so credit unions may continue to grow, thrive, and prosper and put less of a burden on our share insurance fund. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions.
Thank you, Mr. McWaters. The second item on our agenda today is the proposed rule part 703, derivatives. Staff presenting Tom Fay, Director, Capital Markets, Rick Mayfield, Senior Capital Markets Specialist, both from the Office of Examination and Insurance, and Justin Anderson, Senior Staff Attorney, Office of General Counsel.
Good morning, Chairman Hood, Board Member McWaters, Board Member Harper. This is Tom Fay speaking, Staff Member of Capital Markets Division, Office of Examination and Insurance. We are here this morning to present to you a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPR, to amend the NCUA's derivative rule. This proposal is intended to modernize the NCUA's derivatives rule and make it more principles-based. In doing so, we are proposing to eliminate some of the more prescriptive limitations and requirements of the current rule, but retain the key safety and soundness components, all with the goal of providing more flexibility for federal credit unions to manage interest rate risk using derivatives. Back in January 2014, the board finalized the NCUA's current derivatives rule in Part 703, which only applies to federal credit unions. Federally insured state-chartered credit unions must have authority from the applicable state regulator and then are required to notify NCUA if they plan on using derivatives. The NCUA board at that time, having gained insight into the management of derivatives by credit unions through both natural person investment pilot programs and corporate credit union expanded authorities, determined that such activity could be beneficial to end users by helping them to optimize liquidity and capital positions while also reducing risk. These were important conclusions supporting the final 2014 derivatives rule that remain relevant today. As noted in the preamble in the proposed and final versions of the 2014 rule, the board concluded that it was both safe and beneficial to authorize the use of derivatives for managing interest rate risk. The NCUA authorized derivatives after more than a year of deliberation and did so with caution and restraint. It was guided by a philosophy that credit unions should walk before they run when using derivatives for the first time. As such, the scope of the 2014 final rule was intentionally prescriptive. The rule acknowledged that most federal credit unions had a little experience using derivatives for interest rate risk, and there was a corresponding need for the NCUA to increase its own specialized expertise to supervise the use of such instruments. For example, the rule placed restrictions on specific product types, the total amount of derivative transactions, and a robust pre-approval process for federal credit unions. Finally, the implementation of the 2014 current rule required significant call report changes. In the 6.5 years now since the current rule has been in effect, staff has gained the requisite knowledge and experience through oversight of credit unions actively using derivatives and by reviewing the federal credit union derivative applications. Credit unions using derivatives have also gained valuable experience and insight into their hedging activities. There has been no material concerns noted with derivative transactions during this period, which reinforces the NCUA's belief that prudential use by credit unions has been both effective and safe. This experience has helped the NCUA streamline the focus of examinations while also identifying areas where additional prudent regulatory relief could be granted. Also, subsequent to the 2014 final rule, NCUA revised its interest rate risk guidance, strengthened its risk oversight procedures, and enhanced specialized training to ensure that our staff remain sufficiently knowledgeable and capable to supervise these activities. On another note, many of the relief items in this proposal were included as the part of the board's December 2018 regulatory reform agenda. The comments on the agenda were generally supportive of the principles-based approach for federal credit unions in managing interest rate risk, and this gives us critical insight into how our stakeholders are likely to view this proposal should it be approved. As for credit unions, their book of business results in a natural incidental risk exposure to changes in interest rates. This is to be expected, and in fact, balance sheet mismatches have long been evident in depositories, including credit unions, and so it is a risk area for which our capital market specialists are trained. We witnessed significant changes in the composition of credit union balance sheets over time, trending increasingly toward a more borrow short and lend long risk profile. And at the same time, with interest rates moderating lower and lower. The need to manage the inherent risk arising from interest rate mismatches between assets and liabilities is what makes derivative authority incidental to the business of credit unions. We believe that credit unions should employ all the tools and strategies to manage their interest rate risk exposure that make sense for their respective situations, and the failure to do so could result in significant losses of income and capital in extreme market conditions. While credit unions have always used traditional on-balance sheet methods for managing interest rate risk, derivatives can be an effective alternative, and we feel this proposed rule serves to enhance the utility of derivatives further. Staff believes the time for introducing a more streamlined, modernized derivative authority in regulation is appropriate now. In fact, there is almost never a period in an economic cycle when managing interest rate risk isn't relevant. This proposal does not depart from the current rule's focus on prudential safety. Some of the guiding principles used for this proposal are no different from the ones we use to formulate the current rule, which are, number one, to acknowledge credit unions are exposed to rising interest rates. Number two, to be responsive to that threat, but understand derivatives aren't a fix-all. And number three, to limit the scope of derivative authority to interest rate risk management only. I will now summarize the main parts of this proposal. Number one, we are providing clarity for transactions related to managing interest rate risk for loan pipeline activities, only for loan pipeline activities, by centralizing derivative-related rules in Part 701, 703. Number two, we would allow federal credit unions to purchase investments in mutual funds which use derivatives to manage interest rate risk. Those funds obviously must also meet the general investment authority. Number three, we are removing the prescriptive derivative product list and moving to a more characteristics-based approach. This includes that derivative transactions must be denominated in US dollars, use a domestic interest rate, and have a term of no longer than 15 years. We are retaining the prohibition of written options and embedded derivatives, both we think of which offer a higher level of complexity and potential risk exposure. One side note on the use of a domestic interest rate, staff continues, by the way, to monitor the eventual cessation of US dollar LIBOR, which is currently scheduled for the end of 2021. We know that derivative transactions account for 90% of LIBOR exposure in the US and globally, and so we continue to monitor that situation. Number 4 on the changes, we're removing the regulatory limits for total loss and total notional amounts. Number 5, we're streamlining the requirements around counterparty agreements, margin requirements, and eligible collateral, as these have become very standardized in the marketplace. Number 6, in the current rule, we require an application from all prospective federal credit unions. In this proposal, federal credit unions with total assets over $500 million and a CAMEL management rating component of 1 or 2 will only be required to notify Ncua after they start using derivatives. The notification requirement for state charter credit unions will continue, but we will be required only after they start using derivatives. Number 7, as I mentioned, we are retaining much of the safety and soundness related requirements, which include, first, retaining the internal derivatives reporting requirements to the credit union board of directors and senior executive officers. Ncua examiners will now have access to these reports as part of their examination process. Second, that the federal credit unions have the requisite experience to support derivatives in all functions, including that the board will continue to be required to receive training and, at a minimum, an annual briefing on the derivatives program. Third, that federal credit unions conduct an internal controls review, a liquidity analysis, and have comprehensive policies and procedures and the required separation of duties. And fourth, that federal credit unions will continue to report any regulatory violations to the applicable regional director. My last point on the changes is on the impact of this proposal, which would have on the agency resources. The removal of the pre-approval process will reduce the upfront time in reviewing applications, but most likely some of that will be shifted back into the scheduled examination for credit unions who have started using derivatives. We will also revise our capital markets training and produce a new examiner guide for derivatives. In conclusion, the proposed rule would modernize our derivative rule, provide more flexibility for credit unions to use derivatives, and still maintain the critical elements of safety and soundness. If in fact credit unions increasingly do embrace the use of derivatives to safely hedge interest rate risk, we believe it could lead to a net reduction in the overall risk to the Share Insurance Fund, which we see as a beneficial public policy outcome. Chairman and the board, that concludes my presentation. We'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tom, for your presentation, and I'd also like to thank your team for all the hard work that went into this rule. Earlier this year, the derivatives rule was identified as possible relief to help credit unions, given the low interest rate environment and the robust mortgage lending activity, in order to give credit unions more flexibility to help member owners during the economic downturn, and also to help them be able to hedge the interest rate risk from putting these loans in portfolio on their balance sheets. I am pleased that we've been able to refine the derivatives rule and make it more flexible for federal credit unions. This is indeed an unprecedented and uncertain time for all credit unions as they are facing the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. The financial challenges that arise from high unemployment, falling interest rates, and compressed net interest margins are happening right before our very eyes and are making it increasingly challenging for credit unions. Any tool that can efficiently and effectively improve financial performance and strengthen liquidity and capital is a sound pursuit, provided it can be done safely and affordably. On its surface, the derivatives rule may seem like something that's not an obvious action for responding to the current financial pressures facing credit unions during the crisis. However, I believe that enhancing the ability of federal credit unions to better protect themselves against market risk is critically important at all times. In fact, managing balance sheet risk through a time of disruption and uncertainty clearly underscores how important it is for credit unions to have tools like financial derivatives at their disposal to help guard against volatile economic periods that can hurt liquidity, earnings, and capital. I know, though, that the very word derivatives can have a negative connotation and often carries a high-risk stigma. So let us be clear. We are talking about a conservatively utilized subset of financial derivatives within a prudential framework that are used to strengthen a credit union's risk management. And we're only talking about the kind of derivatives that offer straightforward interest rate risk protection, such as interest rate swaps, futures, and caps. We never contemplated permitting non-interest rate contracts or allowing credit unions to speculate by underwriting options to generate income, or by doing transactions that were not hedging their own balance sheets. I support this rule because we've observed credit unions successfully using derivatives to hedge risk arising from changes in market interest rates. These institutions have navigated the learning curve and built up their systems and expertise in a manner that demonstrates it can be done safely. After years of supervising derivatives and seeing these successes, we can reasonably conclude they play a critical role in helping to reduce the uncertainty that, again, comes from changing interest rates for credit unions that use them. One area, however, that does concern me is the prominence of the LIBOR rate and the realm of interest rate swap markets. The fact that LIBOR is going to be discontinued in the near future raises significant questions about its replacement and the impact on extending contracts written with the LIBOR index. I know staff is actively monitoring the eventual cessation of LIBOR scheduled by the end of 2021, and we have made this, ladies and gentlemen, one of NCUA's supervisory priorities. We know that derivatives can range from the most basic type of simple fixed to floating interest rate swaps to more complex products like credit default swaps, options, and commodities futures. Again, we are relegating credit unions to the basic and simple varieties. As of June 30, 2020 call report data, we had 23 credit unions with outstanding derivatives transactions and interest rate swaps and interest rate caps totaling $10.3 billion in notional amount. That's a decent level of activity from which to guide our understanding of current derivatives use within the credit union industry. I know we've come a long way since we adopted the first rule. I certainly appreciate the approach taken by the NCUA board in 2014. That rule was our first comprehensive regulatory framework for these transactions, and it provided a large number of federal credit unions with the ability to pursue derivatives authority through an application process. It is now almost 7 years later. We now have the benefits of having observed the industry's use of derivatives, our buildup of staff's experience and expertise in supervising those activities, and the rollout of specialized training to increase our staff's knowledge of derivatives and to also keep it current. The past 6 years have seen some significant financial trends that support the need for enhancing the derivatives rule. The industry had significant asset growth during this period, increasing by 57% since first quarter 2014, with over $1.7 trillion in total assets today. Most notably, real estate assets are now 33% of all credit union assets in the industry and a critical source of income for credit unions. Helping to protect against further net interest margin compression in a low interest rate environment continues to be a monumental challenge, and I think having tools like derivatives authority is increasingly important. I mentioned that the safety and soundness considerations also remain paramount. I'm comfortable with the approach in this proposal. While removing the more prescriptive elements of the current rule, it still retains the critical safety and soundness requirements in assessing the quality of a credit union's personnel and internal controls for managing their derivatives program. In summary, I believe this program will provide responsible regulatory relief without posing undue risk to the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund. I'm now Tom and the rest of the team with us this morning. I do have a few questions. Most of the derivatives transactions entered into by credit unions in the past 6 years have been interest rate swaps. I understand that many of those swaps have a floating rate tied to the US dollar LIBOR index. How will the eventual cessation of LIBOR impact credit unions using derivatives, and what happens to the swaps that are already outstanding?
Good morning again, Chairman. This is Tom Fay, and I'll answer that question. Most, if not all, derivative contracts that I'm aware of are governed under the 2006 ISDA definitions. Now, ISDA, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, is soon, if not already, has published a supplement amending the 2006 ISDA definitions to incorporate the new fallback rates. So as an additional protocol, will also be published that will enable market participants to incorporate those revisions into their legacy transactions. So in other words, ISDA is approaching this in two ways. You have a legacy book of transactions which now need to fall under a new ISDA definition in terms of what fallback rates or the event of a permanent discontinuance of LIBOR, and the language they would have to implement for any new transactions, which should be probably little or none. But until LIBOR is officially gone, they will have language for any new prospective transactions. Also, one more note on all of this is that Ncua made the review of credit union LIBOR transactions a supervisory priority this year, and our examiners have procedures in hand to assess how these preparations are progressing. That concludes my remarks, Chairman.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And I do have one other question. I agree with the safety and soundness measures being retained in the proposal from the current rule, as credit unions do need a strong risk management process when using derivatives. Given the proposed removal of the regulatory limits, how will staff further rely on credit unions' policies and procedures to be satisfied that they are indeed managing these products effectively?
Good morning, Chairman. This is Rick Mayfield, and I'll answer this question. As with other credit union activities, strong policies and procedures are the foundation for operating in a safe and sound manner. During the exam process, examiners will focus on the quality of the credit union's policies and procedures to ensure they comply with the regulation and sufficiently address risk management within the credit union. In particular, examiners will examine policies sufficiently ensure that derivatives will only be used to manage interest rate risk. In addition to ensuring credit unions have sufficient policies and procedures, examiners will also ensure the credit union is actually in compliance with both documents and they are updated when needed. Finally, examiners will focus on the credit union's risk modeling for net economic value, earnings at risk, and projected liquidity to ensure they are inclusive of derivatives accurately. That concludes my remarks.
Great. Thank you, Rick. And I thought I had just two questions, but I do want to just ask another about LIBOR and its cessation. Recognizing that it will be leaving in 2021, what are we doing as an agency to tell credit unions what rate they should use? Are we giving them the flexibility to choose whatever they'd like to use, whether it be the Federal Reserve SOFR rate or whatever index they'd like to use? I know that question often comes up doing a lot of my credit union outreach efforts.
Yes, Chairman. Tom Fay again, and I'll take that one. Yes, of course, the fallback in replacing LIBOR is obviously going to be entirely up to the institution, but not only the institution, because most transactions have a counterparty or a bond trustee or a bond issuer. So some of that will have to be negotiated. Obviously, SOFR, which is highly regarded and proposed to replace U.S. LIBOR, is not entirely the same rate. One is where SOFR is a credit risk-free rate. So there's no mandate, especially from NCUA, as to what rate you use to replace LIBOR. What we're looking for is, are there provisions, is the fallback language, and are you preparing for a transition away from LIBOR as part of your procedures? Those are my remarks.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I think that's going to be really helpful as we put forward this rule to just let folks know not only that, but also to perhaps offer some training sessions and webinars and things like that. So thank you all. I have no further questions. I'd now like to recognize Board Member Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Tom, for your overview of the proposed updates to the NCUA's 2014 derivatives rule. And thank you, Rick and Justin, for lending your expertise for any questions that the board may have. The proposal before us would add a timely and useful interest rate risk management tool without the upfront administrative burden and could provide greater flexibility for tailoring risk mitigation strategies that can immediately benefit federal credit unions seeking to increase hedge effectiveness. In my view, the targeted updates included in this proposal would streamline our derivatives regulation and, based on our experience, sensibly improve the authority of federal credit unions to purchase and use safe derivatives designed to manage their interest rate risk. As a result, I will support issuing this notice of proposed rulemaking for public comment. With the growth in long-term mortgage lending within the credit union system, the industry now has half of its assets in long-term real estate loans, and the vast majority of those loans are at fixed rates. The savings and loan crisis taught us what happens when an industry lends long and borrows short. Specifically, it can be very problematic when a depository institution moves from a low interest rate environment, like we are experiencing now, into a high rate environment. In that regard, the proposal before us today is forward-looking. Consistent with safety and soundness, under this proposal, more federal credit unions will gain access to the tools they need to manage interest rate risk. Federal credit unions that use simple derivatives will also still need to have specialized expertise along with appropriate policies and internal controls to support an effective derivatives program, just as they did when the NCUA board finalized the current derivatives regulation in 2014. Over time, significant changes in credit union balance sheets, primarily resulting from increased mortgage lending, raised the NCUA's concerns about the industry's exposure to adverse rate moves, especially interest rate risks and the material threat of rising rates. That led the NCUA to issue 2 advance notices of proposed rulemaking in 2011 and 2012 to explore potential derivatives authority for hedging purposes. In 2013, the NCUA board issued for public comment a notice of proposed rulemaking on giving qualified federal credit unions new expanded authority to hedge interest rate risk with financial derivatives. And in early 2014, the NCUA board signed off on a final rule permitting approved federal credit unions to use specified plain vanilla derivatives as interest rate hedges. Recognizing that the use of plain vanilla derivatives can be beneficial in helping credit unions to mitigate interest rate risk, the 2014 NCUA board believed it was appropriate to allow qualified credit unions to use certain types of derivatives for the limited purpose of interest rate risk mitigation. Rightly so, in my view. Insights and observations from the pilot program helped shape the criteria contained in the 2014 rule approved by the NCUA board, thus reinforcing the approach that authorized derivatives should be limited for interest rate risk mitigation only and not for speculative purposes. Since the adoption of the 2014 rule, NCUA staff has gained further knowledge through supervising derivative activities. Their experience helped the NCUA progressively streamline the focus of its examinations while also identifying areas where the NCUA could grant additional flexibility consistent with safety and soundness. Based on the responsible track record of derivatives transactions observed in the industry over the past 6 years and on the knowledge and experience gained by both the NCUA examiners and credit union practitioners, NCUA staff have now recommended a transition from the current prescriptive restrictions to a more principles-based regulation, which still maintains important guardrails. 3 significant elements of this proposal include eliminating the pre-approval process for complex credit unions, those with more than $500 million in assets, and which have a CAMEL component management CAMEL component rating of a 1 or a 2. Permitting all other federal credit unions to apply to use derivatives, and eliminating the regulatory limits on the amount of derivatives a federal credit union can purchase. With respect to these volume caps, the NCUA initially constructed these speed bumps to check risk. Over time, however, we have learned that volume limits decrease the ability of a credit union to sufficiently hedge its interest rate risk. The proposal before us addresses this problem by removing these regulatory limits. This evolution of the NCUA's derivative rule is appropriate at this time. I would also like to thank Chairman Hood and Board Member McWaters for agreeing to incorporate several of my suggested changes into the proposal before us today. These changes provide important guardrails to protect the safety and soundness of the credit unions using derivatives and safeguard the share insurance fund. First, I felt it important to clarify that examiners may request and review all comprehensive management reports about derivatives during the supervisory process. Because of the complex nature of derivatives, credit unions must be transparent and forthcoming with their reports on derivatives transactions during the supervisory process. Second, I wanted to ensure that we continued regular board training on derivatives. Even plain vanilla derivatives are a sophisticated financial instrument that requires close monitoring. A one-and-done board training requirement would have been insufficient. Credit union board directors are the first line of defense of the share insurance fund, and they need to have a firm understanding of derivatives transactions reinforced from time to time through trainings and briefings. The proposal before us strikes a reasonable balance on board education. Third, the proposal ensures that credit unions using derivatives maintain a separation of duties to ensure effective governance. I appreciate the staff's suggestion on how best to ensure separation of duties and proper internal controls. A federal credit union's process, whether conducted internally or by an external service provider, must have appropriate separation of duties for asset liability management, financial reporting, derivatives execution and oversight, and collateral, counterparty, and margining management. This separation of duties is necessary to ensure the safe and sound operation of a derivatives program and to mitigate opportunities for insider fraud and abuse. In conclusion, I concede that we live and operate in a pandemic-induced economic uncertainty. Interest rate risk will continue to be a potential threat, notwithstanding the Federal Reserve Board of Governors' recent pronouncements. However, as the proposed rule notes, quote, the anticipated pressure on earnings and capital over the next few years caused by historically low rates will pressure many institutions to explore both on-balance sheet and off-balance sheet strategies, unquote. Federal credit unions cannot rely on luck to manage their interest rate risk, and plain vanilla derivatives have become a conventional tool for many depository institutions to hedge their risk through price fixing and insurance contracts, such as interest rate swaps and interest rate caps that serve to better optimize earnings and preserve capital. For all these reasons, I will support issuing this notice of proposed rulemaking to update the NCUA derivatives rule that would provide targeted and effective relief for credit unions that hedge their interest rate risk using safe derivatives transactions while maintaining appropriate guardrails. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no further questions or comments.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Harper. I'd now like to recognize Board Member McWaters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the modest and thoughtful proposed changes to the derivatives rule that will reduce the regulatory burden on credit unions from using sensible interest rate swaps. Prudently hedging interest rate risk with properly structured and underwritten interest rate swaps will serve to enhance credit union profitability and reduce safety and soundness risk. I also encourage the agency to conduct webinars on the derivatives rule so as to assist the credit union community in better understanding the technical aspects of the rule. In prior jobs, I worked with derivatives and I worked with ISDA contracts. And although derivatives contracts are really nothing more than separating economic ownership from legal ownership, they can be intimidating, as is the Ncua derivatives rule itself. Yet, in the environment where we are today, the interest rate environment, the super low interest rate puts pressure on credit union profitability. That causes credit unions to look for investments with a higher yield. If you look at the yield curve, chances are there's a temptation to reach out for yield. In other words, to buy instruments with long-term fixed rates that are a few basis points higher. The problem with that, if interest rates rise, and chances are they will, the value of that asset purchased or mortgage held on the books will go down. That's the interest rate risk conundrum. So using an interest rate swap to be able to perhaps reach for yield a little bit, but then mitigate that risk with a derivative of swapping one exposure long-term for short-term exposure can be helpful. So although it's a business decision for a credit union to use interest rate swaps, gentlemen, and this is a question I have for you, what can we do as an agency to offer a better technical understanding of our rule where credit unions can look at it and not be intimidated either by the term derivative, which is really quite simple, or the rule, which is a bit more complex?
Good morning, Board Member McWaters. Tom Fay again, and I'll take that question. I think to your point, as we know, and as the chairman already stated, the stigma around the word its associated danger and the potential loss have always given it as sort of a bad name. But when properly used, can really help in managing a balance sheet's duration and its earning potential. I think the webinar idea is good. Of course, we would use the final rule perhaps as a reason to do that so we could destigmatize and demystify, the word derivatives, how it's traditionally used for traditional banking and traditional interest rate risk management. And so I think a little bit of that would probably go a long way. Those are my remarks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you a lot. I think our job is to help explain our rule. It's a independent business decision by the credit union as to whether or not the use of a derivative, use of an interest rate swap, let's say, fits their business model. It's not for us to, of course, promote this or not to promote this. We're agnostic. Here's the rule. You, credit union, use it if you think it can be beneficial. But if you just look at a textbook analysis, super low interest rates, pressure on profit, the pressure to reach for yield, this seems to me, from my experience, a prototypical environment where you would use, or something like an interest rate swap could be a good idea for an institution if it fits their business model. That's all the questions I had, Mr. Chairman. I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. McWaters. I would just like to note that I am delighted that all three board officers agree that we are going to need to have ongoing training and education regarding derivatives and those credit unions who wish to use them. So I'm hoping that Tom, you and a lot of the other colleagues with us today will maybe take that to note and begin thinking about some really impactful training that can be used to accompany this rule. So again, delighted that all board officers, we see the need for the training and to make sure it is used effectively and properly for those credit unions that wish to use them. And again, it's not going to be for all of them, but those who wish to, as a part of their business model, we welcome and encourage them to do so. Now I'd like to ask, is there a motion?
Yes, I move that the board approve proposed rule part 703 of NCUA's rules and regulations for a 60-day comment period as attached to the board action memorandum.
Thank you. Is there a second to the motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, a second.
There is a sufficient second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and let the record show the motion passed 3-0. The third item on our agenda today is Final Rule Part 704, Corporate Credit Unions. Staff presenting, Scott Hunt, Director, Office of National Examinations and Supervision. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, Chairman Hood and board members Harper and McWaters. Marvin and I are here today to request the NCUA board approve the final rule amending Part 704 of NCUA's Rules and Regulations, which governs corporate credit unions. At its February 20, 2020 meeting, the board proposed amending the agency corporate credit union regulation, Part 704. The proposed rule provided a 60-day comment period, which the NCUA board extended to July 27, 2020 in light of the pandemic. In general, commenters supported the proposed changes, though I will also point to a couple instances where they did not. Corporate credit unions play a critical role in the credit union industry by facilitating payment and short-term liquidity management services to most consumer credit unions. Part 704's provisions reflect the systemic importance to the industry. The proposed final rule updates, clarifies, and simplifies several provisions of the current regulation. Specifically, the final rule looks to adopt the following. Corporate credit union governance. The final rule adopts proposed language and expands the field of credit union officials eligible to serve on the board of a corporate credit union to include any senior staff position at a member credit union. This allows for recognition of a wider variety of expertise benefiting a corporate's governance. For example, the new language would permit a chief risk officer, chief information officer, and chief accounting officer to serve as a board member. Treasurer and manager would remain eligible to reflect common titles for smaller credit unions. Commenters supported this proposal. Risk management expert. Corporate credit union enterprise risk management programs have evolved and matured since Part 704 was amended after the 2008 financial crisis. Staff believes the current rule has provisions that may be overly prescriptive and is ripe for revision as an effective risk management process is driven not only by the risk management expert, but also by the institution's policies, procedures, culture, and qualified knowledge. The proposed revision to the risk management expert allows corporate credit unions flexibility to hire a qualified expert and provides relief without concern over impeding challenge. The final rule removes the prescriptive language to define independence and the experience for a risk management expert to serve the ERM committee. The current rule requires 5 years experience, though it does not detail the quality of experience. The proposal redefined the experience element as commensurate with the size of the corporate credit union and the complexity of its operations. As to independence, the rule removed language prohibiting the independent expert from reporting to the CEO, president. This reflects that contemporary practices allow for a chief risk officer to serve as the expert. While the CRO may report to the CEO, this position can report to the ERMC directly, including the board. Commenters supported this proposal. Net interest income modeling. staff proposes reducing the minimum horizon for net interest income modeling from 2 years to 1 year. This change, while minimal, provides a measure of relief to corporate credit unions in forward-looking modeling of net interest income scenarios. Most balance sheet assets and liabilities reprice and or mature within a year for a corporate. Therefore, the 1-year outlook is a prudent minimum measurement period for NII modeling. Longer-term risk will be captured through existing net economic value standards. Commenters supported this proposal. Corporate Qsos. Corporate Qsos are subject to greater restrictions and reporting requirements than consumer credit union Qsos to recognize an increase in systemic risk. As the agency has limited regulatory oversight over Qsos, it is mindful of risk that could occur should a corporate credit union move parts of its critical payments operations into a Qso under its control. In evaluating whether relief can be provided, staff considered there's greater transparency of ownership through the Qso registry. With this transparency, staff believes non-controlling interests may provide opportunities for corporates to partner and invest in Qsos without undue concern for systemic risk. Thus, the proposed rule allowed for non-controlling investments in consumer Qsos without subjecting the Qso to the Part 704 conditions. The final rule proposes establishing a de minimis corporate credit union investment threshold in a Qso, which must be met or exceeded before the Qso is reclassified or considered a corporate Qso. To fall within the de minimis threshold, the investment must be a non-controlling interest. Less than 25% of the Qso may be owned by a single corporate credit union, and the aggregate corporate credit union ownership must be less than 50% of the Qso. A Qso not meeting the definition of a corporate Qso continues to be subject to the requirements of Part 712. The second Qso-related change for Part 704 relates to Qso Lending Limitations. Currently, Part 704 establishes individual and aggregate limits on loans to corporate Qsos. The limitations are in place because these types of loans or investments are illiquid, frequently are higher credit risk, and have limited marketability. Some commenters ask that the final rule double the Qso limit on such loans now that a corporate can partner with a consumer Qso. Staff does not agree due to the risks associated with such lending. Proposed final rule applies the limits to loans to consumer Qsos. Lastly, a provision was added for member business loans to align Part 704 with previously passed NBL rule changes. After considering comments, 2 proposed changes are not being adopted in this final rule. The first change proposed included the list of approved corporate Qso activities currently posted to the agency website as an appendix to the rule. Commenters expressed concern about the increased regulatory burden of making future changes to the list versus the current process. To be responsive to commenters' concerns, we are proposing not to adopt this change, instead continuing with the current process where we post approved corporate Qso activities to the agency website. The second proposed change is related to subordinated debt. The draft proposed rule included adding a requirement to deduct investments in consumer credit union subordinate debt from corporate credit union Tier 1 capital. This was included in the proposed changes to Part 704 in case the board acted on the subordinated debt rule commensurate with or before bringing this final rule to you today. As this did not occur, staff recommends not acting on this proposal today. Upon acting on the subordinated debt rule, the board can contemplate adjustments to Part 704 at that time. This concludes my remarks. Marvin and I would be glad to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you for your presentation, Scott. In 2010, the Ncua Board comprehensively revised the regulations governing corporate credit unions to provide longer-term structural enhancements to the corporate system in response to the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. Part 704 has been amended several times over the years and was last amended in 2017. At that time, the board established a minimum retained earnings ratio target and amended corporate credit unions' capital standards to change the calculation of capital for corporate credit unions after meeting the minimum retained earnings ratio. The provisions of the 2010 rule and subsequent amendments successfully stabilized the corporate credit union system, and it greatly improved corporate credit unions' capital positions and earnings ratios, and enhanced their ability to function and provide services to natural person credit unions. The COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent economic downturn has demonstrated the effectiveness of this rule. Unlike the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, corporate credit unions have successfully managed their portfolio of investment securities through the pandemic-related market disruptions. This is a success story for everyone, including our corporate credit union leaders. As you all know, the Ncua reviews all of its existing regulations every 3 years. Part 704 was part of the Office of General Counsel's 2019 Annual Regulatory Review. The board received several comments on updating Part 704 as part of the 2019 Regulatory Review, and I subsequently met with the corporate credit union leaders to hear their views. The proposed rule issued in February 2020 was intended to be responsive to our 2019 meeting by providing a measure of regulatory relief where prudent and increase overall transparency of the rule. The Ncua received 35 comment letters on the proposed rule from credit unions, both corporate and natural person. Credit union leagues and trade associations, individuals, corporate Qsos, and an association of state credit unions also provided us with their feedback. I was pleased to see commenters largely agreeing with the proposed rule changes, especially the revised definition of a corporate Qso. At the same time, where commenters did not agree with our change, such as moving the Qso activities into an appendix to the rule, we listened and will not be making this change. I believe this rule will indeed help provide needed relief and increase transparency. I also want to emphasize I encourage innovation in the credit union industry, and I'm delighted that this rule opens up corporate credit unions' abilities to invest in and partner with all Qso types, not just corporate Qsos. Now, everyone here on the call, that's you, Scott and Marvin, I do have a few questions. Can you first explain why it's necessary to include a provision in Part 704 for member business loans, MBLs?
Sure, this is Scott. I'll answer that. Such loans are essentially loans to businesses, so it's natural to apply the provisions. Part 704 currently contains a reference to Part 723, which governs member business lending. Several years ago, Part 723 was modified from a prescriptive rule to a principle-based rule. The MBL change contained in the final rule aligns Part 704 with the current MBL rule. This is more of a housekeeping type item.
Thank you.
And
one other question. Okay, that's wanted to make sure I wasn't cutting you off. Thank you, Scott. And again, I'm such a proponent of FinTech, and how do we better bring FinTech tools into the credit union industry? Can you please explain how changing the definition of a corporate Qso and the related investment provisions may, in fact, enhance technology and financial services innovation in the credit union industry?
Sure, I'll take that question. This is Scott. Corporates play a pivotal role in providing payments-related services to credit unions, as I aforementioned. The area is changing quickly, increased offerings by third parties, and including Qsos. Corporates engage in partnerships to increase their engagement in product development. Under the current rule, any investment by a corporate in a Qso subjects that Qso to increased regulatory provisions, including a small investment of $1. This can dissuade consumer Qsos from seeking corporate investments. The proposed rule allows for a de minimis investment so that the corporate can become an investor and not be subject to Qso to Part 704 provisions. It's more attractive for consumer Qsos and should help create more corporate partnerships. And that concludes my answer.
Great, thank you, Scott. I have no further questions, and I'd now like to recognize Board Member Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Scott and Marvin, for your presentation about this final rule to amend the NCUA's corporate credit union regulation. I appreciate the hard work that you and your teams have put into this rulemaking over the last year. The final rule before us updates, clarifies, and simplifies several provisions of the NCUA's corporate credit union regulation, including permitting a corporate credit union to make a minimal investment in a credit union service organization without the Qso being classified as a corporate Qso. Expanding the categories of senior staff positions at member credit unions eligible to serve on a corporate credit union's board, and amending the minimum experience and independence requirement for a corporate credit union's enterprise risk management expert. When the NCUA board approved the proposed rule in February, I noted that we needed to move carefully and judiciously in considering corporate credit union regulatory changes. The lesson that we learned from the corporate crisis more than a decade ago is that if we provide too much flexibility to corporate credit unions, it can cause catastrophic trouble for the entire credit union system. The matter before us is narrowly targeted and tailored. The final rule contains appropriate guardrails and makes prudent changes to the corporate credit union rule. As the National Association of State Credit Union Supervisors noted in its comment letter, allowing corporate credit unions to invest in consumer credit union Qsos without those Qsos automatically being redesignated as a corporate credit union Qso will benefit both consumer and corporate credit unions. Additionally, as the Heartland Credit Union Association wrote in its comment letter, expanding the types of senior credit union leaders who can serve on a corporate credit union board, quote, will enhance the board's leadership and enable the corporate's board to acquire the expertise necessary to more effectively govern the corporate credit union, unquote. Finally, and most importantly, staff has assured me that this final rule is safe and sound. Because of these sensible changes will improve the governance and operations of corporate credit unions, I will vote in favor of the final rule. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no further comments.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. I'd now like to recognize Board Member McWaters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The NCUA enacted a series of corporate credit union rules following the financial crisis of 2008-2009. They were aimed at protecting the safety and soundness of the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund and the credit union system. Those rules have served to reestablish the integrity and financial stability of the corporate credit union system. Today, we offer a modest and thoughtful relaxation to certain aspects of the rules that will reduce regulatory burden without threatening safety and soundness. I support that initiative. Gentlemen, would you please help us understand how the ERM role is supervised by the banking regulators in contrast to the NCUA?
So this is Scott. I'll take that question. I certainly view the risk management as a critical function for a credit union and a banking institution, specific to your question. In the Office of National Exams and Supervision, we routinely assess the risk management process at our credit unions, including corporates, through our supervisory efforts. Specific to your question, in banking, there are extensive examination procedures that are applied to the regulators' routine supervision processes. But also in 2014, the OCC finalized guidelines. They were issued as an appendix to a safety and soundness standard regulations that establish minimum standards for the design and implementation of a risk governance framework for large banks, generally those with assets greater than $50 billion. The guidelines were subject to similar rulemaking processes, thereby they carry the stature of a regulation, is my understanding. The guidelines are relatively comprehensive and generally support the 3 lines of defense framework for governance. We don't have such regulatory requirements for credit unions, but certainly, as I mentioned, the supervisory space, we do follow much of what I just reiterated in the spirit of our examinations. That is, we support and evaluate the strong challenge process within a credit union. How does its governance allow to give itself basically an honest assessment of risk so that the decision makers understand the exposure to risk? That's all my remarks, Mr. McWaters.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that very much. Mr. Chairman, I am done. No more questions.
Thank you, Mr. McWaters. Is there a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I move that the board approve final rule, Part 704 of Ncua's rules and regulations as attached to the board action memorandum.
Is there a second to the motion?
I second the motion, Mr. Chairman.
There is a sufficient second. All in favor say aye.
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 All opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and let the record show the motion passed 3-0. And again, thank you, Scott and Marvin, for joining us. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing to end our meeting, but I would like to call attention to International Credit Union Day. Each year in mid-October, we come together as a community to commemorate International Credit Union Day, which recognizes the impact of the global credit union movement that is now 260 million member owners strong. And it also raises awareness about what it means for member owners around the world to have a credit union as their financial partner, which in turn provides them with access to affordable financial products. This year marks the 72nd anniversary of International Credit Union Day, and it's a wonderful occasion to celebrate the difference credit unions make in their members' lives. The theme for this year's event is Inspiring Hope for a Global Community, and that's fitting because credit unions, despite facing myriad challenges throughout the year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, they've indeed stepped up during this time of economic uncertainty and remained true to their people helping people ethos that has guided them for nearly a century. So again, I certainly want to applaud the work that all of our credit unions are doing both in the United States and beyond, and I wish you all happy International Credit Union Day. That is the end of our agenda today. There being no further business, we are hereby adjourned.